mission is clear. God has called us to be a gospel-centered, missional family of disciples making disciples. In everything, we want to know, love, and obey God by declaring and demonstrating the gospel wherever God has us. 1 year ago, we began the All In initiative. We started asking ourselves, what would it look like if we were all in with Jesus? What would it look like for us to be so gripped by Jesus' grace that it takes us to a deeper place of trust and surrender in the Lord? From the start, our primary goal has been 100% engagement, that every person at Redeemer would open themselves to the Lord to learn what it means to be all in with Jesus, not just with our generosity, but with our entire lives. The result was amazing to witness and humbling to experience. Family after family, person after person, stepped out in faith and committed to a 2-year journey of generosity. Together, we celebrated over $9 million in commitments to fund God's mission through Redeemer. We've heard powerful stories from people in our church sharing how God has deepened their faith and how they've experienced the joy of putting God first in every area of their lives. We've seen record Sunday morning attendance, celebrated kids born at Redeemer that are now being baptized years later, students coming to Christ and beginning to live on mission, people raised up and sent out to the nations, disciples being made, and new churches being planted. These stories are evidence of God's faithfulness and His work in each of us. But even with all that God has done, we know that He is not finished. Over the next year, we'll continue to grow deeper in our discipleship and we'll continue to widen our reach. Our vision is not just to see more people come to church. Our vision is to make disciples who make disciples, to reach 1% of our city with the gospel of Jesus. Over the next 4 weeks, we are diving into a new sermon series titled First, and we're going to explore what it means to give ourselves first to the Lord and experiencing His grace and seeing it extend to more and more people. If you've joined us since last year's commitment, I want to invite you on this journey. This is your invitation to experience the joy and spiritual growth that comes from trusting God in every area of your life. Now, many of you started this all-in journey last year. Possibly things have been more challenging than you originally thought they would be when you made this commitment. For you, committing to finish strong to your original commitment might be a huge step of faith. I want to encourage you to lean into God and do exactly what He's asking you to do. Ask Him to give you the faith to continue giving in a way that puts Christ first. There are others of us who are on this all-in journey, and it's not that our original commitment was easy, because it likely required a lot of faith at that time. Maybe God has provided in some ways that you weren't expecting, and if you're really honest, the commitment that you made really doesn't represent your first and best. I want to remind you that generosity is not just about money, it's about discipleship. Going all in is about a lifestyle of trusting God with everything we have, from our finances to our relationships to our time. God has more for us, more faith to grow, more generosity to experience, and more people to reach. As we enter the next year of this discipleship initiative, our prayer is that God will multiply its impact, that what God is accomplishing in us will continue to move through us to transform our church, our city, and the world. We have an opportunity to help even more people understand just how wide, just how long, how high, and how deep God's love is for them. Right, love that. The narration could use some work, but outside of that, really encouraging stuff. Hey, I'm really glad you're here. My name's Dusty. I'm one of the pastors, and really grateful for all of you being here. And this is going to be a really unique next 4 weeks. So, and want to invite all of you, even if this is your first Sunday, into what we believe God's doing with us here. That we're continuing on in 2 Corinthians. So that may not feel like a unique series, but here's what's interesting. We're going to spend 4 weeks of these next 2 chapters in 2 Corinthians. Corinthians, and in the entire Bible, or in the New Testament, it's the longest continuous stretch of teaching on giving and generosity and the whole thing. Like, it's 2 straight chapters of it, and which does say something about like the importance of it, that the Apostle Paul, when he's writing to this church, he would feel a need enough to say, hey, let's just chat about this. Like, this is significant enough. And so we're talking, that's the topic, is giving and generosity. Now, let me cue it up this way. Whenever a word you're going to see used, in fact, it's used 10 times over these 2 chapters. Keep in mind, on generosity, a word you're going to see is grace, 10 times in relation to generosity. And just as a quick definition for grace, just so we can all be clear on what we even mean by the term. The term, and this will be up on the screen, is freely given, unmerited favor, and love of God. The freely given, unmerited favor, and love of God. And I got that from a very technical Greek comment. No, I'm kidding. From dictionary.com. That's what it said, which is, I'm like, that's a great definition. I'm going to run with that. And so it's the love of God that we didn't earn. You didn't do anything. It's unmerited. That's what we mean by grace. And just think about how shocking it is that that's going to be the operative word for the next 4 weeks, going over 2 chapters in a letter to an early church from the Apostle Paul. And the reason that's shocking to me is, I think for most of us that come in today, that the last word you would use to describe your interaction in the past with giving, generosity, all of that whole drawer, my hunch would be that would be the last word you would use to describe your experience with this. Out of all the words you could choose to use about giving and generosity, it might be something like coercion. It might be something like it might be something like pressure. It might be obligation. It might be duty. It might even be, that you might have even sensed from the people making the ask that there was like a self-serving motive. Maybe even people were, running off with a lot of material comforts from the general. I mean, no telling. But my experience in the past would be that a lot of us have grace would be the last word you might use to describe. You might even be in your generosity doing it, but it may not feel like grace to you. And I'm hoping that this passage today is going to turn the whole conversation on its head and a different framing and understanding. And it's actually the main reason why we're doing All In together over these 2 years is for this reason. So what I'm going to do is pick up in chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians, and I'm going to pick up in verse 1. We're going to go through the first 9 verses and just work through it and just see the surprising bends and twists through it all. Here we go. Verse 1, it'll be up alongside of me on the screen, or you can follow along in the copy of the Bible that you have. All right, so this is the Apostle Paul writing to the church at Corinth, and here's what he says. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God. So there it is, the first out of 10 references in these 2 chapters on generosity. Brothers, we want you to know about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. So here's the setting a little. Now, we just heard about the Macedonians last week in chapter 7, and now there's a reference, but a little bit different of a feel this time. So here's what it seems like is happening over these 2 chapters. That there's a relief effort for some people in Judea, that would be the area that Jesus roamed around during his ministry, that were having a tough go, and they're raising a collection to help them. And it seems that the Corinthian church had made, early on in the process, had made a commitment of like, hey, yeah, we're in on that, we'll help. Now, we don't know if along the way there's been some cold feet when it came time to collection, or some resistance, or if this is just a friendly reminder. We don't really know. Again, we're getting to hear one side of this conversation, but there has been a past commitment, and that'll become clear over the next couple of Sundays as we walk through this. So there's resistance here, and here's what's interesting, or there could be resistance. That what's interesting about it is that, okay, so let's just say that that's the most obvious topic, or the most obvious issue is that they've committed in the past, but maybe they're not, when it comes time to actually funding the relief efforts, they're perhaps getting cold feet. You think about all the different ways that you could step into that space. that, just think about, again, maybe some of your past experiences at churches, that one way you could do it is you could really do a lot of arm twisting, and you could do a lot of shame and guilt tactics. You could. That'd be one way to go, is how dare you? Do you not know the word commitment? Let's get that up on dictionary.com or whatever, and really laying it on thick and letting people hear about it, belittling them, shaming them. And even the whole comparison with the Macedonians is, we're going to see in a second, they are relatively poor, that the Corinthians actually are fairly well-to-do. And can you just even imagine this whole thing, with a lot of finger wagging of, here you are, and you've got your nice car, and you've got your nice house, and you've got your nice vacations, and you're not even willing to contribute. Look at these guys. They don't hardly have anything, and who do you think you are? And you could just imagine the tone of something like that. And so, but instead, the way he's going to talk about it is, you're going to have a very gentle hand on this conversation throughout. It's going to be a very gentle hand pointing them to grace, and even highlighting an example, but not a shame on you example, but just highlighting a work of grace, and even just beckoning the Corinthians into a similar work of grace in them. So I just want to point you back to the language here. I want to talk about the grace of God that's been given among the churches of Macedonia, the grace of God. Now, a lot of us may think what we mean by grace might be, like your only interaction with this might be like, what, did a bunch of Macedonians become Christians? Is that what happened? That there's the grace of God among them? And very clearly from the rest of this passage, that's not the way that Paul is using grace. That can be. Many times in the New Testament, you'll hear grace spoken of as the grace that we receive through Jesus' death and resurrection, and it's the means by which we are converted, salvation, whatever term you want to use. So certainly, grace for salvation. But what Paul means here, though, is something about grace for everyday life. And there's an ongoing kind of grace. A redeemer, in redeemer parlance, we use the term gospel-centered, and that's what we mean by that term. That's shorthand for grace for salvation. Yes, the hope of Jesus' salvation is real through the cross and resurrection, but it's also grace for life, like every day. Grace for growth, grace for everything that you're facing. And it just so happens that that the whole thing about the way that God is giving grace to the Macedonians is going to be as they are growing in generosity. It's crazy, really. Verse 2, let's pick up, and you're going to see it more clearly here. For in a severe test of affliction, this is talking about the Macedonians, again, as an example, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. So this is a crazy verse when you think about it, whenever you think about the juxtaposition of affliction and extreme poverty with a wealth of generosity. Those words are used there on purpose. And what's going on probably with the Macedonians, again, we only know some things, is we know that they're extremely poor. That's the language that's used here in verse 2. But there's also affliction. It could be broader than that. Some commentators think that what had happened is some of the Macedonians may have been ostracized for their new faith in Jesus. So, canceling, like we talk about cancel culture, is not new. That isn't something that just got invented in the last 5 years. That's what societies do all the time. When they disapprove of what something someone's done, they can ostracize socially and say, you know what, we're not going to do business with you. You're a banker or whatever you might be. We're not going to bank at your bank anymore, since we know that you have left what we all believe and are believing in this other thing. Then they're cut off, and so they're probably having a really tough time making a living. They may have been cut off from their families, and this would remind you of a lot of places around the world now. A lot of our goers, that's the settings they operate in, where when someone comes to Jesus and commits to Jesus, that person may kind of be carved off from their family in terms of regular interaction. But in any case, we know we could just go with what it says, that there was, in the middle of the affliction and the extreme poverty, there's an abundance of joy. That's one phrase that's used, and an overflowing in a wealth of generosity. So in the middle of their poverty, the Macedonians are willingly giving, and there's generosity that's flowing from them, and so much so that the way that he would even describe their emotional interaction with that, in spite of their poverty, is joy. That's a word that's used there, an abundance of joy, and overflowing
overflowing. There's a wealth, even though they're poor. I mean, how crazy is that? And that's what's going on there. So a too long didn't read version of what's going on with the Macedonians is that generosity was the tangible grace that the Macedonians were given. That the grace in verse 1 that's being spoken of, that the grace that's been given to them is this joy of generosity, apparently. That's the connection. And it was a grace to them. Yes, there was a grace that flowed from them to the relief efforts, for sure. And that'll become more clear over the next few weeks. But there's this incredible thing that God did in them. And so you're like, how does this happen? How does this work in the middle of extreme poverty and possibly being ostracized socially? That there's a million ways we could talk of God being generous to us, that in creating us, first of all, he gave life to us. We could talk about the grace that's been given to us in salvation through Jesus' death and resurrection. Yes, for sure, that he's given any material thing that you have has been given to you by God. Every relationship has been given to you by God. Like we could go on and on and on, and it would be, I've got a good friend that starts every day journaling 5 things that morning that he's grateful for. And I just think that's a great practice about like, you've given this to me. You've been kind to me in these ways. So yes to all of this. However, in addition to this, like another layer in this that seems to be clear is that their experience of generosity itself is one of the graces that God has given them to grow in a deeper experience of God's generosity to them, that the generosity flowing through them to meet this need apparently has brought a deeper sense and expression of God's generosity. It's as if kind of something that we've talked about here a lot is that whenever we go from, hey, I have these thoughts about who God is, but then it moves to actual worship, that whenever it becomes expressed, there becomes something powerful in our soul. And apparently that's exactly what happens in generosity. If an abstract idea of God's generosity to us becomes much more concrete in its expression. So I've had like 3 conversations this week with, it's almost like those Russian eggs. You ever seen those that you kind of take one off? There's like a bigger one, and then you pull it off, and there's a medium-sized one, and then you pull it off, and there's like a smaller one. I felt like the same guy in 3 different life stages I had the same conversation with in the last like week and a half. And like the littlest little egg inside of it was a guy just about to start his career, and he was talking about how he's not even making money yet. He's about to. And he was just talking about how his mind is already starting to get ahead. And like, man, if I were to do well at this, I'm starting to imagine, it was actually a really honest conversation. And he said, I'm starting to imagine like maybe some people that haven't really respected me, and maybe a high school teacher that never thought I'd amount to anything, maybe a parent, who knows what, that I'm going to really prove it to them. And already just starting to think ahead that if I'm really successful, here's all these creature comforts and respect, and he's not even making anything yet. And he's wrestling with what money could mean, good and bad to him, and even like some possible unhealthy thoughts he's had attached to it, okay? So then medium-sized egg, this week I bumped into a couple of guys and ended up sitting down with them for lunch. And they're like just a step ahead of all this. Like they are in their careers and doing well, starting to raise families, each of them. And they were just talking about like the heavy anxiety that they feel just on this launch phase. And they're, getting more established in homes and different things like that. And the pressure they feel at work to continually perform, to provide for their family, and just the weight of responsibility, and also just trying to make money work and all of that. And then like I leave that and I go and bump into another guy right after that would be like for the purpose of this conversation, like the biggest egg, in those little cascading set of smaller ones, that was like another click up from that's raising older kids, and was talking about feeling a lot of pressure and anxiety related to work and trying to figure some stuff out, wondering if they're in the right spot. It's just so interesting. And can you see how, like, this is what, and I could be like one egg level up from that's having kids that are just about to be out of the house and about to be empty nest. And there's some of you in here that are an egg bigger than that, and you've got kids out of the house and you're retired, but you're trying to wonder if you've got enough, and your body's starting to fail a bit more, wondering if you've got enough resources. And can you see how for people, all of us, this is just the human condition, wondering if we've got enough, and working really hard and trying to make a go of it, and we feel this pressure and anxiety. Can you see how generosity is a grace to us in the middle of, even whether you're looking forward to your career, you're in the middle of it, you're on the back end of it looking backwards while we deal with resources and pressure, even what a powerful weapon it is to actively release resources when you're so worried about them. So again, another too long didn't read, if just personalizing it where it's not about Macedonians, generosity is a tangible gift. It's a tangible grace to us, not just to them a couple of thousand years ago, but it's a tangible grace to all of us. Gary Schwantz over here, and I'll probably will butcher this, but I read his book years ago, and he talked about the change from got to get to. Did I get that right? Is that close? Okay, I'm working on it. And it's instead of obligation and duty, instead it's oh my goodness, I get to participate in this, and it's something that God is doing in us. Verse 3. For they gave according to their means. Again, this is talking about these relatively poor Macedonians. They gave according to their means, and as I testify, beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. There are these Judean Christians. They're begging to take part in it. And I love this, that a couple of phrases here, according to their means and even beyond their means. Like they dug really deep to meet these needs of these other Christians in another part of the world. And let's talk about that briefly, that based on the research, that positive thing, Christians do give to charitable causes at a significantly higher clip than people that don't have any kind of faith background. So there is that. But proportionally, in general, it's like woefully sad, like what contributions look like for a lot of Christians. It would feel probably how most people, again, I'm talking American Christians in general, experience generosity, that it might be one of those iPad screens that gets put in your face at nearly everywhere you go. And you're like, yeah, I'll throw in a couple bucks. Sure, you made the burrito for me. You know, what the heck? No big deal. And we'll go for that. That's how a lot of us approach it, that it's just like maybe a little bit extra cash that I don't really need or don't really want. And it's not something that's really all that significant. And by the way, I think this is one reason why, like I just want to say, just even shout out specifically to a lot of our youth age students, middle school, high school, and a lot of college students, that a lot of us, you can feel like, I'm going to keep this in mind. Someday when I actually have money, I'm gonna totally be about this for sure. But what's interesting is like this is something that you're even being called into now. Keep in mind that a lot of you that think you don't have money, you're 100% who a lot of the companies nationwide, they market you because you actually probably have more discretionary money than I do. We're actually spending it on fun things and not necessities and all that. Is you do have money, and this is just even calling the question again about like, okay, you've got resources, and this is a conversation for all of us, and what does it look like to even say, okay, Lord, I'm going to get in front of you and ask what this looks like for me. And so they went beyond their means, and it's not just a seventh grader that might say my money when you get Christmas money or things for the chores. A 58-year-old feels the same exact way. They've worked their whole life hard for things, and it feels like my money, and I want to get the things I want with it regardless of life stage. And it can be really powerful to start doing this now. So of their own accord would be the other phrase, and this is really important that there's no, and this is maybe corrective for people in my role, probably maybe even more than for you, is that nobody was twisting their arm for it. Nobody was laying it on thick, singing, people need the Lord, another 8 verses, and we're going to wait and see if anyone here will commit, that kind of thing. No one's doing that. There's no arm twisting, no manipulation, no smoke and mirrors. Rather, there was a need that was laid out there. It's good to lay out the need. That's what Paul's doing. There's nothing manipulative or self-serving about laying a need out. However, there is a real question about, hey, but is this self-serving? And are you being manipulative? And are you twisting arms? And are you pressuring people in? It's really important for giving to not be coerced. We'll even see this next week where Paul will say, hey, in my judgment, in other words, this is not a command. This is just my advice. And I think while generosity is a command that needs to flow from the lives of Christians, any particular offering, I feel really strongly, there never needs to be a walk the plank moment of you better or else. And you may be like, well, of course, but there are loads and loads and loads of religions out there that like you don't get to play anymore if you aren't giving. Like they check, and if you don't give, you don't get to play. Like you don't get to regularly participate in all of the religious things if you're not regularly giving. It's like you better, sure, it'd be great if you did that, but we are tracking, that kind of thing. So they did it of their own accord. Verse 5, and this, not as we expected, they gave themselves first to the Lord and then by the will of God to us. So notice the order of this on how they wrestled. This grace that was given to them, not duty, not obligation, not you better, you oughta, you got to, none of that, that there is this own accord, a desire to do it. The way that they did it, now you're going to get a big hint on why generosity is a grace to you, to me, is that they gave themselves first to the Lord. So this is one reason why. You had a little thing that was handed out to you that was an instruction about all in and the commitment card inside of it, that one of the pieces of language that's really important to us is that when we talk about the primary purpose of this, it's not about the South Campus and reaching 1% of our city and growing deep in the Lord. That's secondary. That's really important. It's not that makes those things insignificant. That's like the relief effort for the saints in Judea. That's important. It's significant. That's the give to. We do want to reach our city. We care about it. That's something significant to us. But the primary component is this one: is give yourselves first to the Lord. We want to see 100% of every person here today give yourself first to the Lord. And that would mean, if you're not a Christian, then of course, you're not going to be doing like a commitment card. You're not going to be joining us on all, like it's going to be in terms of ordering and priority. It's going to be an opening up of your heart to the generosity of Jesus, the cross and the resurrection. For the first time in your life, experiencing grace of forgiveness and being near to God and all of this. For Christians, it's going to be this whole exercise of getting from the idea of generosity as a general thought to something very specific with a specific ask, is it gets concrete and it calls a question in all of us that is really significant. And every Christian is really called into a place of, okay, Lord, I'm going to get in front of you. I'm going to give myself, before we talk about expansion and before we talk about reach and before we talk about youth and college and growing deep as disciples and church planting and mission, yes, to all that. But before all of that, what's the most significant is the generosity that you've given to me, the grace that you've given to me. And that's what the Macedonians did as an example, is that they gave themselves first to the Lord. That's the first step. And then by the will of God to us, in other words, their specific ask that was in front of them. And I love this. This is, all of this can feel like a burden and obligation, but this is inviting into grace. Verse 6, accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, that he should complete among you this act of grace. So again, he's saying, hey, Titus is going to come and collect. But the way that he's talking about it is an act of grace. Isn't that crazy? Instead of tightening screws, arm twisting, bludgeoning with shame and guilt, instead, it's like, hey, we're gonna make that initial willingness you had concrete in the offering. But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. In other words, generosity. That's shorthand for generosity, describing it as an act of grace. I say this not as a command. Again, there's that soft hand of like, I'm not saying you gotta, I'm saying you get to. I'm saying you get to. And I'm saying this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love is genuine. And so like if this was in Redeemer language, that if this was all put into language that we would use, it would be something like, hey, look, Redeemer, you are learning in your understanding of the Bible. Like the other night, a vision night, like legitimately goosebumps. I was just getting people to raise their hand. Hey, how many of you for the first time at Redeemer something? And one of them was, for the first time in your life, you started reading the Bible while you've been here at Redeemer. And it was like 70+% of the room. Like honest, like goosebumps watching that happen. And so you're learning to read the Bible, and some of you are having a real hunger, and like at our institute on Monday nights, to like grow even theologically and really putting pieces together in the Bible. And you didn't used to know about church planting domestically, and you didn't used to know about mission sending to the unreached. And you have learned the value of community and having friends that you're walking in faith with, and you're growing in prayer. That's something that's really building and growing here at the church. And you've learned another one was crazy, is like a ton of hands went up when we said, hey, you've learned to share your faith here, and loads of hands went up. And like, so you've grown in all of these things. And what Paul's saying is that is awesome. He's not throwing shade on any of that. You've learned and you've grown, and you're reading the Bible, and you're learning to pray, and you care about the nations, and you care all this, and you've grown in those graces. Grow in this one too. This is another grace to grow in, is this area of generosity. Excel in this. And just as a point of confession, that for a long time, I'm saying like, I don't know, like the first 8 years, 9 years of Redeemer, this passage, I would have taught it. All right, I would have taught it. And I would have talked in general about, hey, and generosity is really important as like an idea, like a big picture idea. But I don't know that I ever really went to like specific asks, and it stayed in the abstract. And I think something to a point of conviction for me that I've learned, it was a real mistake, is that just think it through. If generosity specifically, like with specific asks, is a grace to you, like I do you harm. And I think I did this church harm by not getting specific about it and saying, look, this is our money. And it's crazy that the games that we'll play to hold on to it. It's like, well, I kind of give my time, and my time's really valuable. So if I'm serving in the kids area at $200 an hour, whatever, that's kind of like me giving money. And like, we'll do all these things. And like, well, I'm only a college student, and I'm only this, and I'm on a fixed income. I mean, we'll do a million different things that we'll do to incredibly hold on to it. It's incredible. Like we'll stand on our head to hold on to it. And what a sad thing it is that to not even have an opportunity to say, hey, here's the opportunity. Even Jesus, like this was a shocker in my study. You can see this in Luke 8. Jesus was walking around healing and preaching the good news of the kingdom, and there's a couple of women that funded it. Isn't that wild? Like at some point, Jesus and the disciples said, hey, it's going to actually take money for us to travel around town to town. We've got to have food, have places to stay, and have to have all that. And there's a couple of people that said, yeah, we'll make that happen. And then the joy of entering into that and the gift of entering into that, it's an incredible thing. Last verse. For you know that the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, in other words, he was in heaven, and he was with the Father being honored as he should, yet for your sake he became poor. He became a human being so that you, by his poverty, by emptying himself out, think Philippians 2, becoming like us, all the way to his death on the cross, that by his poverty, you might become rich. Doesn't mean that if you trust Jesus, you're going to be really rich. That's silly. And all kinds of very poor Christians worldwide. But it's talking about, spiritually speaking, that when God emptied himself out in Jesus on the cross and through his resurrection, he entered into our spiritual poverty, became spiritually poor, even physically entered all of human experience, and through the death and resurrection of Jesus, spiritually enriched us. And then even on top of that, in this generosity of Jesus to us, when that passes through us, as God does this work in us, it becomes even more concrete as with actual money passing from our hands. Even though we've worked for it, we pass it on, and for whatever reason, I would even say at a certain level that it's supernatural, that something about this generosity passing through us makes grace more concrete to the soul, which is why I get it with all of the bad experiences many of us in here have had with generosity and asks from churches, missionaries, people, whatever. I get it. There's all kinds of risk in this conversation, that God intends good for you in the middle of it. Clearly, that's the whole point of these 9 verses. So what I want to do is I just want to invite you into this. First to the Lord. That's the idea. This series is called First. And listen, if you're not a Christian, when you see this commitment card as we're praying through this in the next few weeks, that of course that's not the ask for you. The ask for you is, for the first time, first to the Lord, to open up your soul to God's grace through Jesus' death and resurrection. For all of the Christians that are here, look, I love the fact that there's no easy formula. I have no idea what this means for you with your particular life stage. How could I possibly know this? That isn't between me and anyone else. This is you and the Lord. First to the Lord, then by God's will to us. Like that's how this still works. So I want to encourage you even to use this as a tool for the next few weeks to get in front of the Lord, first to the Lord, and experience his generosity towards you. And then whatever that answer for you that reflects that, what a beautiful offering to the Lord that is. So I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray for grace to ring out through this church over and over again. Lord, let this happen in us, through us, all of it, that there would be a grace that would flow throughout this room. Any deeper